My name is Madison Parker. I'm 27 years old, and if someone had told me 10 years ago that I'd inherit my grandfather's entire empire worth $5 billion, I would have laughed in their face. Back then, I was the unwanted daughter, kicked out on my 18th birthday with nothing but a backpack and a sneer from my parents. "You'll never survive without us." So imagine walking into a courtroom last month, facing those same parents, perfect suits, fake smiles, my older brother Ethan sitting beside them like he already owned the world. My mother leaned in, her perfume choking the air, and whispered sweetly, "Of course, Madison, we'll manage it all for you." My father nodded smugly, as if my life, my future, and $5 billion were already in their hands. But when the judge turned to the next page of the will, their smiles froze, then shattered. I grew up in a house where appearances mattered more than love. My parents, Richard and Diane Parker, weren't poor, far from it. Dad was a regional executive at a logistics firm. Mom was the type who lived for cocktail parties and neighborhood gossip. But if you looked beneath the polished smiles, you'd see the rot. They only valued the child who fit their perfect image. That child was my brother, Ethan. He was the golden boy, straight, a student, football star, the one my parents paraded at dinner parties. Every victory of his was a family celebration. When Ethan got accepted to his dream college, Dad opened champagne. When I wrote a short story that won a local contest, Mom shrugged and said, "That's cute, but it won't pay the bills." It wasn't that I was rebellious. I wasn't sneaking out or breaking rules. I simply didn't fit the mold. I liked art more than sports, books more than cars, quiet nights more than loud parties. For that, I was branded difficult. When I asked why Ethan got a brand new car at 16 while I patched together rides from friends, my father's jaw tightened. "Life isn't fair, Madison. Learn your place." By the time I turned 17, the tension in the house was unbearable. Every dinner became a trial. Mom would roll her eyes whenever I asked for basic fairness. Ethan would smirk across the table, twirling his car keys, basking in the glow of being untouchable. And Dad just looked at me like I was a problem he couldn't wait to get rid of. I'll never forget the night he leaned forward, his voice low and sharp. "If you're still living under this roof by 18, you're a failure." The words cut deeper than any slap. I laughed then, because what else could I do? But inside, I was shattering. And when my 18th birthday arrived, they made good on their promise. It wasn't a quiet dismissal, it was a performance. Mom called me into the living room, Ethan lounging on the couch like it was a show. Dad stood tall, holding an envelope. "We've decided it's time you learn responsibility," he said coldly. "No more money, no more support, you're on your own." The envelope held nothing, no check, no safety net, just a symbolic gesture that they were done with me. I packed what I could into a backpack, 2 changes of clothes, a sketchbook, and my phone. When I hesitated at the door, Mom's voice rang out, syrupy but cruel. "Don't worry, sweetheart. You'll thank us one day." That night, I slept in the back seat of my old car, staring at the ceiling, wondering how my life had unraveled so completely. Meanwhile, Ethan posted photos from his fraternity party, smiling with a brand new MacBook Dad had bought him. The only person who didn't abandon me was my grandfather, William Parker. He invited me over on weekends, fed me, let me crash on his couch when I had nowhere else to go. He never said much about my parents, but the way his eyes darkened when their names came up told me he knew the truth. In time, he became more of a father to me than my own ever was. The years after I left home blurred into survival. I worked part-time jobs, studied when I could, and scraped together enough to rent a shoebox apartment. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. Through it all, my grandfather, William Parker, was the only family who never turned his back on me. He'd slip me grocery money when he thought I wasn't looking, invite me over for Sunday dinners, and remind me with a firm squeeze of my hand, "Madison, you're stronger than you think." So when the call came, it knocked the air from my lungs. Grandpa was gone. Even though I knew he had been sick for a while, some foolish part of me believed he'd outlast us all. Stubborn, steady, unshakable. Losing him felt like losing the only anchor I had left. The days after his death were a fog. I expected nothing from the estate. Maybe an old watch, a letter, something small to remember him by. I certainly didn't think I'd be summoned to a will reading in the county courthouse. When the official envelope arrived, embossed with the seal of the probate court, my hands shook as I opened it. Inside, the words were clear. The heirs of William Parker are required to attend the reading of his last will and testament. My name was listed alongside my parents and Ethan. I almost didn't go. Part of me wanted to grieve in peace, away from their toxic orbit. But another part, perhaps the one my grandfather nurtured, refused to let them write me out of his story. So, on a gray Monday morning, I walked into the courthouse. They were already there, of course. My parents, Richard and Diane, dressed as if attending a gala rather than their father's will reading. My mother's pearls gleamed against her silk blouse, her lipstick a shade too bright. Dad sat with his hands folded smugly, his cufflinks catching the light. And Ethan. Ethan looked like he was born to inherit an empire. His navy suit was tailored, his grin wide as if the entire proceeding were just a formality. When I stepped through the doorway, all three of them turned. My mother's smile stretched too wide, sugary sweet. "Madison, darling," she cooed, as though we hadn't gone years without speaking. "I knew you'd come." Dad gave a curt nod, his eyes already drifting back to the attorney's briefcase like a hawk watching prey. Ethan smirked and muttered just loud enough for me to hear, "This will be fun." I sat down across from them, my pulse hammering in my ears. The air felt thick, suffocating, as though the walls themselves knew what was about to happen. The attorney, a sharp-eyed man named Mr. Whitmore, cleared his throat and adjusted his papers. "We are here to read the last will and testament of William Parker," he began. My mother's hand brushed mine, her nails pressing slightly into my skin. "Don't worry, Madison," she whispered. "Of course we'll manage it for you." My father nodded smugly, as if the billions were already in his account. They had no idea what was about to hit them. The room was so quiet I could hear the rustle of papers as Mr. Whitmore, the attorney, flipped to the first page of the will. My parents leaned forward. Ethan stretched back like a king awaiting his crown, and I gripped the edge of my chair until my knuckles whitened. "This is the last will and testament of William Parker," Mr. Whitmore began, his voice steady. "Dated and notarized 1 year prior to his passing." My mother exhaled audibly, as though rehearsed. She glanced at Ethan, then at me, with a patronizing smile. Dad rested his hand on his knee, smug and certain. I could almost hear the script they'd written in their heads. Ethan inherits the fortune. They manage it together, and I fade into irrelevance. But then Mr. Whitmore's next words split the air like a thunderclap. "I, William Parker, do hereby leave the entirety of my estate, valued at approximately $5 billion, to my granddaughter, Madison Parker." Time stopped. I swear the clock on the wall went silent. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. My parents froze mid-smile, their faces cracking like porcelain masks. Ethan's jaw dropped, then snapped shut with an audible click. I blinked, certain I'd misheard. $5 billion? To me? My pulse thundered so loudly I barely registered the attorney continuing. "It is my express wish," Mr. Whitmore read, "that this estate be left in her sole possession, with no trustees, no oversight, and no conditional management. Madison Parker is to have full control of the assets, properties, and holdings, effective immediately." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, like vultures realizing their prey had flown from their talons, my family scrambled. My mother's voice shot out first, shrill but laced with sugar. "Well, of course that makes sense," she said, clapping her hands lightly. "Madison was always close to her grandfather. Naturally, she'll need our guidance, won't she, Richard?" Dad straightened, nodding quickly, his smile stretched tight. Yes, of course. $5 billion is, well, it's an enormous responsibility for someone so young, so inexperienced. We'll step in, manage the investments, oversee the properties, protect you from mistakes." Ethan laughed under his breath, the sound cold and sharp. "Don't take it the wrong way, Maddie, but you've never exactly been responsible. Remember when you maxed out that little credit card freshman year? Multiply that by $5 billion, disaster waiting to happen." I sat frozen, every word lashing me like a whip. Their arrogance was staggering. Even here, even now, after my grandfather had trusted me with everything, they couldn't see me as capable. To them, I was still the weak one, the expendable one. Mr. Whitmore cleared his throat. To clarify, he said firmly, Mr. Parker specified that the estate belongs solely to Madison Parker. No trustees, no family oversight, no shared management. His instructions are explicit. Dad's jaw tightened. He forced a chuckle. We understand. We're only concerned for her well-being. You understand, don't you, Madison? He looked at me then, calling me Madison, like it was some gesture of affection, though his eyes gleamed with fury. Mom leaned closer, her nails digging into my arm. Sweetheart, you know we only want what's best. Let us guide you. Grandpa would want us all to benefit. That word benefit hung heavy in the air. Benefit for them, not me. Inside, something stirred. A heat I hadn't felt in years. I remembered every cold night in my car, every cruel smirk across the dinner table, every time they told me I wasn't enough. And now here they were, trying to sink their claws into the one thing my grandfather had trusted me with. I kept my face neutral, my lips pressed tight, but inside, I was boiling. Ethan leaned forward, smirking again. Think about it, Maddie. You're not even a homeowner. You rent. You've never invested a dime. $5 billion will drown you. Dad's managed money his whole career. It just makes sense. For a moment, I almost laughed. They still didn't understand. Grandpa had seen through all of them. He hadn't chosen me out of pity. He'd chosen me because he knew I could rise above their greed. And as their voices droned on, full of fake sweetness and poisonous barbs, I sat straighter in my chair. I didn't say a word. Not yet. But I knew this was only the beginning of a war they could never win. The courthouse scene was only the opening act. By the time I returned to my apartment that evening, my phone was already buzzing with messages from my mother. We should talk, sweetheart. Your father and I know what's best. Don't make rash decisions. Each text dripped with faux concern, but I knew the truth they were circling, desperate. I ignored them. For 2 days, silence. Then, late one night, a knock rattled my door. When I opened it, there stood Ethan, leaning against the frame in his tailored jacket, that infuriating smirk plastered across his face. Without waiting for permission, he walked in. Cute place, he said, glancing around my modest living room as though inspecting a motel. But let's be honest, Maddie. This won't do anymore. $5 billion and you're living here? Embarrassing. I crossed my arms. What do you want, Ethan? He sank into my couch, stretching out like he owned it. Simple. I'm here to make sure you don't embarrass yourself. You've been living small for so long you don't even realize what you've got. Dad knows investments. Mom knows people. And me? I've got vision. Style. Together we could turn Grandpa's empire into something bigger. But only if you stop being stubborn. His words stung not because they held truth, but because they echoed every insult I'd ever heard at home. Small, stubborn, incompetent. He had learned their script by heart. I don't need your help, I said firmly. Grandpa left it to me. Not you, not them, me. For the first time, his smirk faltered. He covered it with a chuckle, but I saw the flicker of panic in his eyes. You really think you can handle this alone? Be smart, Maddie. Hand it over before you drown. I showed him the door. But Ethan wasn't the only one. The next day, my mother appeared no knock, just sweeping in like she still owned my life. She perched on a chair, smoothing her skirt, voice syrupy. Darling, you've always been too sensitive. This money, it could ruin you. Let us shoulder the burden. I stared at her, remembering the night she smiled as she kicked me out. Her nails dug lightly into my arm now, just like in the courtroom. Think of it as a family effort, she cooed. Grandpa would want us all to benefit. Benefit. The same poisoned word. When she finally left, I locked the door and sat in the silence, my chest tight. For a moment, doubt whispered, maybe they were right. Maybe I wasn't strong enough. But then I pictured Grandpa's steady eyes, the way he'd told me, you think before you speak. That's not weakness, that's strength. That night, I made a decision. No more playing defense. From now on, I document every word, every threat, every attempt to gaslight me. If they wanted a war, I'd be ready. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. I thought the whispers and guilt trips were bad, but nothing prepared me for outright betrayal. It started with a phone call. I was at work when my cell buzzed Mr. Whitmore, the attorney. His voice was clipped, urgent. "Madison, I need to ask, did you authorize anyone to access the estate accounts?" My stomach dropped. "No. Why?" He sighed. "Someone presented themselves at the bank as your representative. They tried to withdraw funds. Fortunately, the stipulations in your grandfather's will flagged the attempt. The bank refused." "But, Madison," they were insistent. I didn't need to ask who it was. I could picture it perfectly, my father's stern voice, my mother's sugary smile, Ethan's arrogance all spun into a lie to claim what wasn't theirs. That night, I drove past their house. The lights glowed warmly, the porch as pristine as ever. 2 cars sat in the driveway like nothing had changed. But to me, the sight was venom. They weren't just manipulative anymore. They were thieves. And as if that weren't enough, the slander campaign began. Small towns thrive on gossip. And my parents knew it. Suddenly, people at the grocery store looked at me differently. The cashier who once smiled now muttered, "Must be nice, living off an old man's money." At the gas station, I caught whispers. She stole it from her brother. That fortune wasn't meant for her. Even my few friends pulled away. Phone calls stopped. Invitations vanished. The narrative was spreading. I was greedy, undeserving, a fraud. One evening, sitting alone at my kitchen table, the weight of it all crushed me. I had the money, yes, but it felt like a trap. If I used it, I'd feed their story. If I stayed quiet, I'd drown in silence. For the first time since the will reading, I wondered if maybe they were right. If maybe I wasn't strong enough. My hand drifted to a drawer. Inside, tucked beneath old receipts and a dried-up pen, was an envelope I'd nearly forgotten. It was from my 21st birthday. Grandpa had handed it to me back then with a knowing smile, saying, "One day, you'll understand." With trembling hands, I opened it. The letter inside was written in his firm, slightly shaky script. "Madison, if you're reading this, I hope you've learned by now that the world doesn't give it takes. Don't let them. You are stronger than you know, and one day you'll have to prove it. When that time comes, don't shrink back. Stand tall. They can only steal from you if you hand it to them." Tears blurred my vision as I read those words again and again until they burned into me. My grandfather had known. He had seen through them long before I ever did, and he had trusted me, not them, to rise above it. I folded the letter carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and felt something shift inside me. The fear didn't vanish, but it hardened into resolve. They wanted to play dirty? Fine. I'd stop reacting and start preparing. This wasn't survival anymore. It was war. The letter changed everything. For the first time, I felt my grandfather's presence not just as a memory, but as a guide. His words lit a fire in me. Don't shrink back. Stand tall. I began to prepare. Quietly, methodically. The first step was finding someone I could trust with the financial side of things. Not a flashy advisor tied to my father's world, but someone grounded, meticulous. Through a coworker's recommendation, I met Robert Hale, a graying man with calm eyes and a yellow legal pad permanently tucked under his arm. He didn't fawn over the billions or try to dazzle me with jargon. Instead, he asked careful questions. What do you want this money to mean? What are your goals? Your fears? He listened without judgment, as I admitted I was terrified of drowning under the weight of it all. When our first meeting ended, he slid a simple plan across the table. You're more capable than you think, Madison, he said, shaking my hand firmly. You just needed someone to confirm it. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. With Robert's help, I took small, deliberate steps. I purchased a modest home, not a mansion, just a quiet place where no one could throw me out. Walking through those empty rooms, I whispered to myself, this is mine, truly mine. But I knew money alone wouldn't protect me. My parents were relentless, and gossip was their weapon. So I decided to fight back the way my grandfather would have, by building respect. I joined a local charity board he had once supported. At first, I was nervous, the whispers of undeserving heiress still following me. But slowly, people began to see me as more than a headline. They remembered William Parker's integrity and, by extension, they started to respect me. Then came the turning point. At one of those board meetings, I was introduced to Daniel Grant, a retired attorney in his 50s with sharp eyes and a calm, commanding presence. When he learned I was William Parker's granddaughter, his expression softened. "Your grandfather was a rare man," he said, gripping my hand. "He always spoke highly of you." Over coffee a week later, Daniel leaned in and lowered his voice. "You should know your grandfather anticipated trouble after his passing. He put certain protections in place." My breath caught. "Protections?" Daniel nodded, sliding a worn folder across the table. Inside were documents I'd never seen, ironclad clauses, notarized stipulations. If your parents attempt to interfere or present themselves as your representatives, they're automatically disinherited. Not just morally, Madison, legally. He safeguarded you. I stared at the papers, my chest tight. My grandfather hadn't just left me money. He had left me a fortress. For the first time, I realized I wasn't playing defense anymore. I had leverage, proof, ammunition. Daniel sat back, his voice calm but firm. "They think you're weak. They don't realize you're holding the stronger hand. When they overstep, and they will, you'll be ready." I left that meeting with a new sense of clarity. My parents weren't just up against me anymore. They were up against my grandfather's foresight, my allies, and my determination. The war wasn't over. But for the first time, I felt like I could win. I should have known it was coming. For weeks, my parents and Ethan had been circling like sharks, testing boundaries, sniffing for weakness. They'd tried guilt, manipulation, and theft. Nothing had worked. So they escalated to the one place they thought they could win, the courtroom. It was a crisp autumn morning when Daniel called me. His tone was sharper than I'd ever heard. "Madison, they filed a petition with the court this morning. They're claiming you're unfit to manage the estate. They're requesting guardianship of your assets." I nearly dropped the phone. "Guardianship? I'm 27 years old. That's their angle," Daniel said grimly. "They'll argue you're inexperienced, unstable, incapable. But remember, we've prepared for this." The hearing was set for the following week. The days leading up to it stretched like wire. Every time I stepped outside, I felt the weight of whispers. Neighbors looked at me with a mix of pity and suspicion. My parents had been busy poisoning the well. By the time I entered the courthouse, my hands were trembling. I wore a simple navy suit, nothing flashy. I wanted to look competent, steady. Across the aisle, my parents and Ethan sat together, flanking one another like soldiers. My mother's smile was syrupy, my father's jaw tight with smug anticipation, Ethan practically glowing with arrogance. When the judge called us to order, their attorney stood and launched into a performance. His words dripped with condescension. "Your Honor, my clients are deeply concerned for their daughter. While they grieve the loss of William Parker, they cannot ignore the risk of handing a $5 billion estate to someone as inexperienced and impulsive as Madison. She has no history of financial management, no assets of her own prior to this inheritance, and a record of poor decision-making. It is only logical that her parents, successful, established adults, step in to safeguard the estate." Ethan nodded solemnly at every line, as though rehearsed. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, feigning emotion. My father looked directly at the judge, projecting gravitas. It was theater, and they thought the audience would buy it. Then Daniel rose. He didn't rush. His voice was calm, deliberate. "Your Honor, this case is not about competence, it's about greed." He laid out the evidence one by one, each piece like a hammer blow. The forged attempt at the bank, text messages from Ethan, dripping with condescension, mocking my ability to handle the money. Letters from my parents proposing that I share the inheritance by funneling assets into their accounts. The stipulations in my grandfather's will, ironclad, notarized, explicit that no one but me was to manage the estate. The courtroom grew quieter with each revelation. My parents shifted in their seats, their confidence cracking. Ethan's smugness faltered as Daniel projected one of his texts onto the screen. You'll drown in 5 billion, Maddie. Better let Dad take it. Then Daniel delivered the final blow. He lifted a worn leather notebook, edges frayed with use. This was entrusted to me by William Parker himself. Inside are his handwritten notes, his concerns, his foresight. He anticipated this exact situation. Allow me to read a passage. He flipped to the final page, his voice steady as he recited, "If they attempt to take what is not theirs, it will be proof enough of why I chose Madison. She has endured their cruelty, risen above their neglect, and proven stronger than they ever imagined. My estate is hers alone, not to be shared with those who cast her out." The words echoed through the chamber like a verdict before the verdict. I watched my mother pale, her hand frozen mid-clutch of her pearls. My father's fists clenched against the table. Ethan's eyes darted to the floor, his jaw tight. The judge leaned forward, her expression unreadable. Then, in a voice crisp and final, she said, "The petition is denied. The estate remains solely in Madison Parker's control. Furthermore, this court cautions the petitioners against any further attempts to undermine the explicit wishes of the deceased. This matter is closed." It was over in less than an hour, but it felt like a lifetime. As the gavel struck, my parents' facade shattered completely. My mother turned to me, voice trembling with false warmth. "Sweetheart, you don't understand how much pressure this island. We only wanted to protect you." I stood, calm in a way I hadn't been in years. "No, you wanted to protect yourselves. Grandpa knew it, and now everyone else does too." Her hand hovered in the air, then dropped. My father muttered under his breath but couldn't meet my eyes. Ethan stormed ahead, his heels clicking like gunfire against the marble floor. I walked out of that courthouse with my head high, the weight of years lifting from my shoulders. For the first time, I wasn't the outcast, the failure, the scapegoat. I was the heir my grandfather had chosen and the one thing my parents could never control again. But as I stepped into the sunlight, one truth burned in my chest. This wasn't the end. The legal battle was won. Yes. But the fallout, the reputations destroyed, the relationships severed was just beginning. And I was ready for it. The verdict might have ended the legal battle, but the aftermath unraveled slowly, like dominoes tipping one by one. My parents had strutted into that courtroom believing they could bend the world to their will, the same way they bent me when I was young. The judge's ruling had done more than deny their petition. It had ripped away the masks they had worn for decades. It started small. My mother's circle at the country clubs suddenly grew cold. Where once she was the queen of gossip and brunches, now conversations hushed when she entered the room. I heard whispers from acquaintances. "We had no idea how cruelly they treated Madison. It's disgraceful." She tried to brush it off with brittle smiles, but even she couldn't hide the humiliation. My father fared no better. News of the court case spread through his company like wildfire. Clients who once trusted his expertise in finance began to distance themselves. Meetings were canceled. Eventually, I learned he'd been encouraged to take early retirement. For a man whose entire identity was wrapped in professional authority, the forced exit was a crushing blow. And Ethan. Oh, Ethan's fall was the sharpest. His entire social status had been built on being the golden child, the favored son, the heir apparent. But after the court exposed the attempted fraud and those smug texts, people saw him for what he truly was, entitled, arrogant, and hollow. His girlfriend dumped him. Invitations to parties dried up. Soon enough, word reached me that he'd moved back in with our parents. 3 broken egos under one roof, feeding off each other's bitterness. Meanwhile, my world expanded in ways I'd never dared to imagine. I threw myself into work and into causes my grandfather had cared about. The charity board grew into something larger, and I began to play a leadership role. For the first time, people sought out my voice, not to dismiss it, but to listen. Respect not grudging, not conditional, real respect. I invested carefully, following Robert's steady plan. My home became more than shelter. It became proof that no one could ever throw me out again. Every key I turned in the lock reminded me of how far I had come. But the most powerful moment came quietly. One evening, I drove past my parents' house, the same house I had been exiled from on my 18th birthday. The porch light was on, but the lawn was unkempt. the shutters faded, the paint peeling. It looked tired, worn, almost like the people inside. I parked across the street, memories washing over me. The night they staged my exile, the years of mockery, the endless comparisons to Ethan. For so long, that house had been a monument to my failure. But now, I felt nothing but clarity. They hadn't destroyed me. They had forged me. I rolled down the window, the cool night air brushing against my face, and whispered words I'd never dared speak before. Grandpa was right. I decide what I'm worth. With that, I put the car in gear and drove away, leaving behind the house, the ghosts, and the power they once held over me. The real revenge wasn't in humiliating them publicly. It wasn't in the billions sitting in my accounts. It was in this freedom, the knowledge that I no longer needed their approval, their love, or their validation. They had cut me out of their lives when I was 18. Now, I had finally cut them out of mine.